I think being in Paris was obviously, an emotional and rewarding experience, and it was also a period again of extraordinary political change. This was the end of Giscard and the beginning of Mitterrand. But for me, it was also a bibliographic revolution, because I was able, for the first time, I think, really, to encounter a lot of French philosophical and epistemological writing, Canguilhem, Foucault, of course, Althusser, that was simultaneously Martian and indispensable. I mean, Martian for obvious reasons, because it seemed to make no reference of any kind whatsoever to any materials or traditions with which I was remotely familiar, yet it seemed to be talking about precisely the questions within the sciences that had interested me. And a good example was my work on Herschel. I mean, not, you would have thought, the most promising area to be modish and Parisian and left back. So what was my problem, and what was, as it seemed, the solution? My problem, the very obscure, technical, trivial problem in scholarship, was this. William Herschel was a Hanoverian musician, military bandsman, who came to Britain from Hanover to practice as an organist and choir master, and set up eventually at Bath in the 1770s, with eventually to his sister Caroline. He joined a local philosophical society. He began to study natural history. He got his own microscope. He was fascinated by coral and corallines, because they're the ambiguous natural historical class for a Linnaean. Are they plants or are they animals? Meanwhile, he was also teaching himself how to build telescopes. And from the mid-1770s onwards, he built increasingly large, increasingly magnificent, and by the standards of the time, strange instruments. Because they were mirror telescopes, they were reflecting telescopes. They weren't designed for precision, but for light grasp, for penetrating deep into space. And he set out to survey the heavens. Now, the immediate result of this survey was the discovery of what we now call Uranus in March of 1781, which brought him international fame, the first planet discovered in recorded history, which of course he decided initially to call George. And I wish it was still called George. Having discovered George, the king gave him a pension and a place in the Thames Valley, eventually at Slough, from where for the next 25 to 30 years he ran an unprecedentedly detailed survey of just those parts of the sky astronomers were not interested in. And that's my puzzle. Herschel was not, in that sense, by late 18th century standards, an astronomer, because he wasn't observing stars much. And he certainly wasn't observing the position of planets. He wasn't doing transit observations. He wasn't doing high precision measurement. He was mapping the heavens. He was looking at clouds of light, nebulae, the Milky Way, which were the disturbances in the sky for classic 18th century astronomy. And indeed, several of his contemporaries said, Monsieur, and the French said, it's amazing, this guy has discovered this planet. He isn't even an astronomer, he's a musician. So he wasn't, in that sense, technically perhaps an astronomer. What was he? Well, if one read what Herschel said he says that what he's doing is the natural history of the heavens. So there seemed to be a solution to this puzzle. What he was doing was applying the methods of Linnaean natural history, only not to corals now, but to stars. He says that he proposes to classify them into species. He sees the heavens as full of strata. He says that he's in the position of a gardener who, looking out over a mass of vegetation, sees the same plant at different stages of its growth cycle, and therefore able to reconstruct the growth cycle of the plant from seedling onwards. So that even though one can't, as it were, trace a nebula coming into being and passing away under the action of gravity, we have all its stages co-present to us. And we have that because he's seeing so far. It's Herschel who gives us the notion of light year, and Herschel who insists that when you look deep into space, you're looking deep into the past. Foucault's work seemed really useful as a tool for describing that, because here we had, first of all, a contrast between method and subject. Herschel was using classical natural history, as Foucault had described it, to deal with things classical natural historians typically didn't deal with. And if I read Les Mots et les Choses and subsequent work, I could kind of perhaps make sense of Herschel as one of those natural historians. The fact that he's building telescopes and looking at stars is, not the serious issue. The serious issue is the method and the approach that he was using. So I wrote this ridiculous article called Herschel in Bedlam, which is half Foucault and half Herschel, and sent it to the British Journal of History of Science, and they published it. And it's full of my Paris experience. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Literally, I mean.
Almost literally, yeah. I mean, there are sort of footnotes saying, I've just read this, and so on. And I first gave it at a conference in Bath, appropriately enough, in March of 1980, which more generally is, for me, the important event in the emergence of the social history of scientific knowledge in Britain. Because it was the first joint meeting of the British Sociological Association and the British Society for the History of Science. And it brought together a new generation of sociologists of scientific knowledge: Harry Collins, Trevor Pinch, Stephen Shapin, David Bloor, Barry Barnes, David Edge, mainly based in Bath and Edinburgh, respectively, and fellow travelling historians of science of various sorts, mainly from London, Mike Roy and Michael Neve, and then the odd sort of junior like me. So I got on the train at the Gare Saint-Lazare and ended up in Bath carrying my hot little Foucauldian paper. And I think it went quite well. The Eminence was this kind of vibrant, charismatic, tall, dark-haired, slightly strange, but absolutely brilliant figure at this meeting was a young French anthropologist called Bruno Latour, who was there to talk about the work that he'd been doing with his Cambridge-trained colleague Steve Woolgar at the Salk Institute in Southern California. So everybody was co-present, right? The paper at the conference that impressed me the most was, again, a very strange paper by this guy from Edinburgh, Stephen Shapin, which was on the dispute between Leibniz and Samuel Clarke. In other words, it was on a topic of the thesis I just finished. In fact, my final chapter was on exactly the same thing. And Shapin's paper was called Of Gods and Kings, and it was witty and clever and much better at analysing what was at stake in that metaphysico-philosophical dispute than I was, because it showed point by point the political issues involved in these different cosmologies. And it footnoted anthropologists, again, whom I'd never read or in some cases heard of, like Mary Douglas. So when it came to choosing examiners in conversation with Michael Hoskin that year, it seemed obvious to me that the internal examiner had to be Roy Porter, and the external examiner could be this guy whom I'd never really met, called Stephen Shapin, because he was obviously working on the same thing and might be sympathetic, neither of whom belonged to the Newton industry, so this would help perhaps. So on a, for some reason, very cold, rainy day, that's how I remember it, in London at UCL, which is where Roy then was, in one of the prep rooms of the anatomy department in University College London on a Saturday morning. I had my viva with these two guys. Steve turned up wearing tennis whites because he was about to play a game with Bill Bynum, and he explained very kindly why he was dressed in tennis whites. And Roy explained that I shouldn't worry about the thesis too much, that they'd both taken a positive view of it, but that he'd have to leave the room every 15 minutes or so because he was suffering from quite bad diarrhea. But he'd taken the precaution of bringing along a bottle of wine for us to drink afterwards, which we then drank in little lab beakers, right, before I went home to Cambridge.
They told you at the time you'd passed.
They did, and they shouldn't have done that. It was all ultra vires, but they did. And it was a marvellous experience, and that's how I met Stephen Chapin.
Would you like to talk about him, because you've worked?
Yes. Well, he's really indispensable for my work and life. I think he brings an extraordinary range of resources and strengths to his work and his work with others. Collaborative work is really, really hard, and he makes it really easy. And that seems to me to be an extraordinary trick. In fact, that initial paper of his I'd read before I met him turns out to contain a lot of the germs of these virtues. It moves into what might be taken to be a very familiar area of intellectual history. I mean, what is more familiar, as it were, for intellectual history than a text like the Leibniz-Clark dispute? And because it's quizzical and witty and penetrating on the one hand, yet utterly scholarly and utterly committed to the most exacting standards of philological precision, he's able somehow to find a new and important thing to say about these very familiar texts. Secondly, perhaps even more importantly, he's able to do this without jargon. I mean, I haven't learned as much as I should have done from Steve, but Steve seems to me to be one of the most lucid writers in our field. He's able to show you how to re-examine and reanalyze a piece of work without simply absorbing it under some more general interpretative schema imported from elsewhere. On the contrary, it seems to emerge from the material in question. So there's a deep empiricism to the work, which I find fantastically important and attractive. And the third aspect of it is that there's a kind of respect. Steve's long-standing interest in questions of authority, trust, skepticism, expertise, deference, solidarity and sociability is partly autobiographical. It's because those are many of the themes of the way he lives. He's very respectful of genuine expertise. He's delighted by craftsmanship, by connoisseurship, ranging from well-made silverware to well-made wine, to well-made food, to well-made furniture, to well-made books. He'd moved from a liberal arts college on the West Coast, Reed, to Philadelphia, to Penn, which was one of the headquarters of the social studies of the sciences, had met some very important figures in early social history of science there, Jack Morrell, Arnold Thackeray, figures like that. Did his thesis on the social world of science in the Edinburgh Enlightenment. Magnificent piece of work, which brought him to Scotland and then back to the States. Remarkably, Tom Whiteside had played a minor role in getting Steve initial employment at Keele University to catalogue their library of mathematics books, which they outrageously subsequently sold off to a dealer, and then acquired the post in the Science Studies Unit in Edinburgh from the later 1970s. Extraordinarily charismatic figure and very generous, so that the Leibniz and Clark paper was part of a sequence of papers that he was working on around the theme of the social use or moral use of nature. These would have included studies on the history of phrenology, on the history of matter theory, and so forth. And with characteristic generosity, but also extraordinary perceptiveness, he'd noticed in his work on the scientific revolution and early modern matter theory that there'd been a controversy in the 1660s, which had not been studied, apparently, between Robert Boyle, on whom there was, we're in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a great deal of recent, very important, extremely impressive scholarship by various historians, and Thomas Hobbes. And again, characteristic Steve Chapin, he immediately divined that this might be interesting. Why might this be interesting? This might be interesting because the terms of the controversy call into question the basis of certain assumptions, now so institutionalized we don't recognize them as such. And he was able to develop the notion of playing the stranger. Clearly, his familiarity with anthropological approaches, mainly structural functionalist ones, right? E.P., Mary Douglas, and so on, played an absolutely decisive role there. And I think, in terms of the intellectual history of intellectual history of intellectual history, it's very important to go back to the 60s and 70s and think about the reception history of Evans Pritchard in the humanities, which I think has not been analysed, or not analysed properly, or not really studied at all, right? So that a deferential reference to the chicken means much more than it might be taken to mean. Just as, for example, the notion of hot and cold witches, exactly what kind of argument that is, exactly what kind of methodology is required to make sense of the movement between here and there, between present and past, into worlds that have history or allegedly seem not to, the interests in play in making those interpretive judgments. Those are indispensable for understanding where a certain kind of social history of knowledge comes from. Everybody knows this, and yet it's kind of passed as self-evident, as though there was no difference between Evans Pritchard and oxygen. Right? And it's not like that at all. Right? The same is true, mutatis mutandis, for Douglas's work. Right? I mean, Bleur's paper, which is called Polyhedra and the Abominations of Leviticus, which is a systematic attempt to apply the argument of purity and danger to an episode in the history of 19th century mathematics. Extraordinary article. Not just for its application to the history of mathematics, but also because of the way it uses purity and danger and natural symbols and so on. One isn't saying that these are, reliable versions of the classics of structural functionalism. Surely they're not. But a spanner can be used for many things. And it seems to me we need to perhaps go back and think about what was going on there precisely. So, the notion of playing the stranger, that it would be indispensable to find a contemporary of the founders of experimental method, querying the basis of that enterprise, so that the basis of that enterprise could then be subjected to proper historical analysis. That, at least for Steve, clearly came partly from that anthropological insight, which he'd already tried out in the case of the phrenological work, right? So whereas in the case of the phrenological work that he'd studied, he was, as it were, making the utterly strange plausibly familiar. How could one write the history of the falsehood, like the cerebral localization of Edinburgh phrenologists, which is certainly a falsehood? Well, anthropological methods might help you make the utterly alien make certain sense. That was the game. And in the case of Robert Boyle, the enterprise was the opposite, right? To make the utterly familiar odd. And those are the two things that historians of science have to do. We have to work out how to make the aliens friends, and we have to work out how to make ourselves weird. And anthropological resources clearly help you do that. They're indispensable, but they're not sufficient. So, what was I doing? I was getting a job in London. Hooray. For which I'm eternally grateful. I don't know what would have happened otherwise. Thanks to Margaret Thatcher and Sir Keith Joseph, departments across the country were being butchered. And in the case of the Department of History of Science and Technology at Imperial College, the professor, Rupert Hall, and the reader, Mary Boas Hall, retired simultaneously. And the budget was cut, and they were to be replaced with one junior lecturer. Post was advertised, and thanks mainly to Mary Hesse, who'd been at Imperial, and who wrote me a stellar reference, apparently, I was hired. So my first job. So at the very moment where I was beginning to talk to Steve in the wake of the Viva about this text of Hobbes and this controversy that he was working on as a paragraph or two for a chapter of a book which was to be called The Social Use of Nature, that's how it began. I mean, he needed a bit of analysis of the Hobbes text for a section of one subsection of one chapter of one book. I found myself in London, in a flat in Paddington, so that dates it. Right? No one could now live where I lived. I would walk to work every morning past...
What year is this?
This is 1980, 81. I would walk to work across the park along the Serpentine. How wonderful is that? Past the Albert Memorial and the Albert Hall and the Royal College of Art, and then back in the afternoon along the lake. It was glorious, and I had a wonderful time. Lots of music happening as well at this period in London. Certain problems, because Cambridge had trained me to be a bit lazy about libraries, right? The library at the Senate House in the Ministry of Truth in London and the British Library were kind of more challenging to use than the UL. And between 81 and 83, Steve and I wrote a book, which started epistolary. Really. He was in Edinburgh and I was in London. There is no digital work going on. There is literal scissors and paste. This is the archaeology of knowledge. And we just write letters to each other, typed letters, and then cut them up and paste them together again, and then send them back. And this gradually expanded. And every so often I would go and stay in his absolutely wonderful flat in Brunsfield, which is on the other side of the meadows from Edinburgh University, very near Merchiston, where John Napier, inventor of the slide rule and logarithms, lived once. We'd sit in the Golf Tavern on the links and argue. Occasionally we'd talk to someone else, Harry Collins for a brief period. But it was an intensely cloistered project, which one should remember, right? Or I should remember, note to self. We barely discussed it with anybody else. Right? This was deeply backstage work. We didn't give lectures or seminars about this. That was not what we were talking about. We didn't teach on it. We didn't apply for major collaborative research grants. In fact, the only grant we applied for was a tiny grant, but very much appreciated, from the Royal Society to help us make sure we had covered the extant air pumps that there were. And there are and otherwise it was a very private experience. And I think if the book has virtues, this book that came out at the end of '85 eventually from Princeton, called Leviathan and the Air Pump, one of its virtues is that it was a backstage project, yet intensely conversational. I think its epistolary structure still, at least to me, seems obvious, that it's the two guys trying to convince each other of what they're doing, right? And it was an attempt systematically to see if it was possible to use an approach that had been developed in Bath and in Edinburgh and elsewhere by sociologists of scientific knowledge, particularly sociologists working on scientific controversies, for a passage of past science. Why might that seem to be difficult? It might seem to be difficult because the premise of a lot of sociological study at that period was that one had to follow science in action. Once a controversy was closed, the facts, as Harry Collins put it, would seem to be like ships in bottles, and one would be hard put to it to see how they'd got there. There would be what he called a catastrophic crystallization of certainty, and you would no longer be able to follow the contingencies which had been negotiated in order to make this thing so. So the challenge to historians was obvious. Everybody's dead, there's no oral history to be had, and reopening the possibility of alternative outcomes looked weird and strange. Was it possible to do that? We thought yes, it probably was possible to do that. Partly because of the supreme virtuosity of the protagonists involved, Mr. Boyle and Mr. Hobbs, partly because of the extreme control over the material. The book took longer to write than the events that it describes, after all. And what was at stake, while centrifugal to a degree, it took us into the politics of the Restoration and exactly how do you make a sealant that doesn't leak if you want to join glass and metal to leather in the spring of 1661 if you're Robert Hooke. How do you do that? What kinds of grease and fat do you use? Since whether the air pump leaked turned out to be a really important historical question. I think the book fell stillborn from the press. I remember turning up at Berkeley in 1985 with, again, we're still pre-digital, the proofs of the book, which were printed on a more or less continuous roll of lurid green paper by Princeton, so that in order to read a bit, you had to, it was papyrological, you had to sort of unroll this, no PDFs or anything like that. And we both gave extracts from the book, no interest whatsoever. And almost all the initial reviews were understandably either uninterested or very hostile, with two exceptions. One by Harry, and one by, whom I will never cease to remember with pleasure, Owen Hanaway. He's now no longer with us. Wonderful, tough Glaswegian working class bloke, trained as a chemist at Glasgow University, who'd gone to Johns Hopkins and started a whole program in early modern history of the sciences, especially of chemistry, who seemed instantly to understand what we'd been trying to do. I mean, and he became a lifelong friend, and I mourned his passing, and in fact spoke a eulogy for him at Vancouver back in 2005. Tragic loss. But by and large, this was not a book that changed the world. It changed life for me enormously because it helped me get a job back in Cambridge in 1984. And there I think we'll pause.
I just wanted to mention that it won much later. It came to public notice because you won the Erasmus Prize, didn't you?
That's right. I mean, I can say a bit about that. The Erasmus Prize was established in the late 1950s in the Netherlands, initially as a prize for cultural achievement and scholarship, but cultural achievement in its widest sense. Early winners include Charlie Chaplin, Ingmar Bergman, Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Claude Lévi-Strauss. By the 1980s and 90s, the prize, under the brilliant administration of the Erasmus Foundation, was becoming perhaps slightly more scholarly, but one could still win if one was a group of puppeteers or an architect. The way the prize works, is, as I understand it, is that a field is defined first, and then for that year, and then within that field, exemplary figures are then chosen as the prize winners. So for some reason, the foundation decided to choose for 2005 the field of roughly the social history of science, science studies, and they very generously chose Steve and me as exemplary representatives. And one was presented with the prize by William, Prince of Orange, at the Royal Palace in The Hague. Amazing and unforgettable event. My mother was able to come, which was really one of the things that made it for me. And we were looked after astonishingly well, very embarrassing. I really did think when we got the letters, Steve and I, in early 2005, this was a practical joke by one of my splendid students, because I really didn't think this was plausible. But yes, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, it was made clear to us that this was not for the book, but for our work, but clearly, you know, the fact that it was jointly to us and so on, clearly established the book as the rationale for the prize. It's often cited, put it that way. I rarely recognise a reading of the book that matches my own, but see above, that's how things are in the humanities, and perhaps more generally. I'm just very pleased to have helped, in a minor way actually, make something that people seem to have found interesting and useful. It's Steve's book, I helped, and I think the force there, the force of the analysis, the genial idea of showing how contingencies become certainties in the course of action, the decision to make the very enterprise of experiment a fundamental question. Those are Steve's decisions and intuitions, and thank goodness for that. Also, the way in which, what should we say, a rather relaxed, in the best possible sense of the word, attitude is taken to fraught and complex questions in epistemology and in sociology is, I think, a virtue of that book. The most difficult questions, I think, are tractable with ingenious forms of writing and analysis. It goes back to something we were talking about much earlier in this conversation, about the fact that good ideas happen in the course of work. And that's both the principle through which the book was written and the argument that the book makes. The argument that the book makes is that really important creative innovation happens in the course of detailed, meticulous labour. I see the book as a contribution to the labour history of knowledge, precisely that. Right? And that's why it asks apparently obscure questions like, okay, how many air pumps were there such that anyone could do the work Boyle said you had to do, turn into answers to otherwise rather complex metaphysical questions like, what is it to replicate an experiment? So the book proposes to show how metaphysical questions can be resolved through labour, right? And it shows that analysts' labour can itself resolve what might otherwise seem to be metaphysical questions. So it's a metaphysical question as to how two folk who are very different, doing very different things, in very different places, at very different times, can nevertheless be judged to have repeated an experiment. How could that possibly be? What is it to go on in the same way? That's our version of the question, what is the void? If the void, as Hobbes says beautifully, is no thing, then it can't exist. So, obviously we infringed massively on a whole series of very high status and very proficient areas of scholarship, and were treated accordingly. And I don't regret that, but one has to recognise that. Subsequently, we've both done a deal of work, Steve much more than I, on similar questions. But for me, I think what that work helped do was to give me a certain kind of self-confidence about the virtue of the kinds of questions I was trying to ask. Also, I was able to tell interviewers in the University of Cambridge in 1984 that I was about to co-publish a book from Princeton, and that, I think, helped their decision to hire me as a lecturer in history of science, history and philosophy of science here in Cambridge, starting in the autumn of 1984. I was, in fact, replacing Gerd Buchdal, which only goes to show that, at least in my case, Cambridge works really well if it doesn't get too hung up about disciplinary specialism, right? They weren't replacing Gerd, it must be said, with someone who could do any of the things he did, but I was very grateful for it. At exactly the same time, or almost exactly the same time, my father died of a heart attack, which he'd suffered from coronary disease for many years. He died on the 10th of May, 1984, and I've never recovered from that, I think. He died after giving a talk at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So for a period, neither my mother nor I knew where he was. And we literally had to phone round London hospitals to find that he was in the Westminster. And he didn't last very long. It was really dramatic. And it was appalling. There's no other way to describe it. I was, 29. And as I say, I haven't really recovered from his absence. I still have the experience of pointing things out to him, new things, right? I still feel that I'm kind of within my mind making that very characteristic gesture that one does to one's closest friend. Look at that, or isn't that interesting, or what do we think about that? He absolutely is there for me in that sense as the person with whom I'm constantly comparing my experiences. And without being too maudlin about it, the fact of the matter is that whenever I achieve any success, such as it is, it just makes me sad that he's not there to share it. And we talked about the Erasmus Prize. Well, that's an example. On the other hand, I think it's clearly brought myself and my mother much closer. She has led a very long, active, committed, exciting life. She threw herself into politics in Brighton from the mid-80s onwards as part of the struggle against Thatcherism. She became a Labour councillor for Hanover Ward. She became a very active militant in the anti-nuclear movement and in the Green movement. And she's taught me a lot about how to go on and how to survive and live a full and creative life. That's been a really important still centre of the turning world for me. So 1984 is clearly a crux moment where I come back to Cambridge, and I've been here ever since, where I saw kind of what my career was going to be. I think when I was teaching at Imperial, it was still very much up for grabs. It was, in retrospect, the most productive and exciting period of my academic life, but I attribute that partly to meeting Stephen Shapin and partly to the entire, total, complete and utter absence of any administrative responsibilities whatsoever at Imperial. And also partly to living in London, which is always exciting and fun. But coming back to Cambridge, was really, in a certain way, coming home. And it's been a department that I've enjoyed and delighted in ever since.